Greetings, book lovers everywhere, and welcome back to E-Train Talks. I'm E-Train, a 12-year-old literacy advocate, podcast host, and booktuber. Here on E-Train Talks, I try to shine a light on all things books in the hopes of inspiring others to love reading as much as I do. And my author guest today is a creator of incredible worlds, a wonderful, and truly just amazing reading escape. My guest today is a master of helping kids escape into stories, and I'm excited to talk with today's guest for a number of reasons. One of which is that his newest middle grade book, Spellbinders, the Not So Chosen One, is a work of incredibly epic, entertaining, and everything that I love in middle grade put together. There are meaningful themes, but there's also a ton of action that's sure to keep you on the edge of your seat. So, another reason that I'm really grateful to be talking with this author today is because he's been a great supporter of my book journey as well, and that means the world to me. So, in case you haven't guessed it by the title of his book, I'm talking to the one, the only, Andrew Auseon. Thank you so much for being here today, Andrew.
Thank you, E-Train. That was the best intro I've ever gotten. And I wanted to say, since you so graciously thanked me for being a supporter of yours, you have been such an amazing supporter of mine. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, but I haven't, my publishing journey, I took a little detour from it for a while, and I'm coming back with this book. And it's a little intimidating and scary to jump back into the book world of 2023. And you've just been a wonderful voice for not only my book, obviously, and my series, but also so many different authors and just literacy in general and middle grade books, and just endorsing reading as something that everybody should be doing, but especially kids. So it's you're such an inspiration to so many of us. So thank you for bringing me on today.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm really glad that we were able to find a time and a date and get this interview going, because I'm so excited to ask you my questions and for everybody to hear your excellent answers. So let's get
Excellent.
started.
Let's do it. All right, I'm ready.
All right, so my first question is actually a take on a question you answered in a different interview. In a past interview, someone asked you to describe Spellbinders, the Not So Chosen One, in just one sentence, and your answer was pretty amazing. You said, and I quote, "What if all your wildest dreams came true and made everything in your life more complicated?" To everyone listening, I'm sure, like me, this sounds like a pretty interesting read, right? I mean, not just interesting, it sounds awesome. And I know from reading this book, it has lived up to that elevator pitch times 1,000. I loved Spellbinders, the Not So Chosen One. And I guess my question is, will you expand on the answer that you gave the previous interviewee or interviewer, and share a bit more about your new story, Spellbinders, the Not So Chosen One, in, I guess, a bit more than one sentence?
Sure. Yeah, that was a hard question to answer in one sentence. And hearing you repeat it back to me, I'm like, oh, that wasn't such a bad answer. That was okay. I think for me, it came about, first of all, because I was somebody who and I still do this. I'm still someone who does this, and I think it is healthy. When real life gets difficult, when your own everyday life seems like, whether it's sort of boring or repetitive, or if there are hard things going on in your life, I think it's very natural for us to escape into whether it's other worlds or an app, a puzzle app on your phone, or the movies. It's easy to kind of leave all your troubles at the door, right? And put on headphones and listen to an album or something. And the thing that so that was something I always did, and I always kind of asked that question of, like, are these places we go, are they always free from that kind of baggage? Like, if you're just listening to an album, that's one thing, but if you're going into a world where you think it's all going to be better, and it's a real world with real people, like that kind of escapism isn't going to turn out the way you think it's going to turn out. And the other reason I thought about that was just, it's so easy now for people, and I think especially for kids, but in no way only young people, to distract ourselves with things that take us away from what's going on around us. And for Ben, the hero of this story, he uses games and sort of the conjured fictional worlds and all of their little details and their expansive epic things, to kind of say, oh, well, life would be so much better if I was there instead of here.
Yeah.
And to challenge that idea, right? So to say, oh, well, if you want to be a hero of a story, being a hero is a big responsibility, you know, in the real
Mm.
world and in our world. And so I wanted to test that idea. And then I also knew that there would be a lot of humor and fun in taking two different points of view, which is the two characters you can see behind me, which is Ben and Niara, from these two different worlds. Ben seen escaping into Niara's very real fantasy world as being sort of an escape where it's all going to be easier, and then her, where her world is in peril and she's looking for someone to take it very seriously. The two of them clashing, and that kind of conflict and misunderstanding provides a lot of the humor in the book too. So I knew that would be a funny setup for a lot of those jokes and things.
Absolutely. And that first scene where Ben is kind of talking to Niara and Niara's kind of calling him the chosen one and taking him to the portal to Niara's realm, that really was a great deal of awesome humor, and I found myself chuckling, and I think you all will as well, because Ben just thinks this is also sort of a game, like the ones he creates in his journals. And no, that's not a spoiler, or anything, but because he's supposed to be going to this convention with his friends, or I guess in his mind at that time, like supposed friends. But now all
Yeah,
this is happening, it must be fake. Or I guess it
yeah,
was.
that was sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt that, but that was an interesting part for us to work on, because we had to go back and forth about when does he start to really realize
Yeah.
that things are going differently. Like you said, he's going to a convention with his friends, and there's a lot of, you know, cosplay, dressing up, there's a lot of role playing, they take it very seriously. So at what point does someone realize, oh, this is not just a game or an act of theater, or is this something more than that? And so we went back and forth with when he discovers that it's actually real.
Yeah, and I probably, if I was in that situation, I wouldn't think it was real, even if I was in the world after the portal, because I mean, you can get woozy like Ben did from like virtual reality. You're putting a headset on,
Mhm.
like until you sleep that when you go to sleep in that world and wake up in it the next day. I personally would just think it's still a game, a continuous game that kind of feels never ending, but like
Mhm.
it can't be real.
That's interesting, the sleeping part. That's something I should think about for the next time we bring a new person through a portal into the other world, because I agree with you. I think that's when you wake up someplace, then you sort of have those fresh eyes.
Yeah. Well, my next question for you is about your world beyond just writing books, whether it be young adult or middle grade stories. So
Mhm.
I read that along with writing books, you're also a video game developer, and you have been for over 15 years. And being a video game developer sounds amazing. And I'm a pretty big gamer myself. I play quite a few different video games. I don't know if they're the same as the ones that you develop. And I'm also really curious. You develop games, but do you also play them yourself?
I was lucky enough to grow up when video gaming was really becoming part of mainstream culture, and becoming part of people's living rooms and doing things with your family and friends. So I got hooked on them really early. And I mean, at the same time, I was also a big gamer when it comes to board games and role playing games. So I was already excited about uh, those uh, those franchises and those different titles and things that my friends and I would play, and we would think about and make our own. But then video games came along, and it's funny because at that point, video games were made by very small teams of people, and they kind of did everything.
Mhm.
And they were mostly programmers who sometimes they would do writing and art, but they would kind of wear a lot of hats. And so
Yeah.
I never thought I would be able to work in that business, because I am not somebody who's really great with computers or with technology and math. um, so I didn't think it would be a future for me at all. But like with books, it's something I did want to do.
Mhm.
Once I saw that the stories could be really compelling and exciting, and express something real about human emotion, the human experience. Um, So yes, to answer your question, I've been playing them all my life. I still do. I still play a mixture of board games and video games, and that's kind of what I spend a lot of my free time doing is thinking about what I'm going to play next and trying to find time to do it. So
Yeah.
it's been a big part of my life.
Well, that's awesome. And I really like what you said about how there wasn't how you really realized you could help create these games when you saw like human emotion in the games, which
Hmm.
makes a lot of sense. Like the earlier video games like Pac-Man or Atari, all the games made by Atari or Galaga, Space Invaders, they were just, I guess, robots or kind of creatures on a screen, I guess you could say.
Right, right,
But it wasn't until there were games that really kind of dug deep into like humanity. I mean, they're video games, they're not that deep,
right.
but like, I mean, you could talk about a game like Halo or even possibly like the Mario games from around the early like to late 90s or the 2000s that kind of really could get you excited and feel like you could create these games.
Hmm. They had a lot of games too that they started introducing that were games that allow you to make games. I think
Oh,
Little Big
cool.
Planet was one. Like there's the Mario Builder game. I can't remember if that's what it's called, but Mario Maker, where you make your own levels. So people could start experimenting and trying to like make levels for their friends. And then with the internet, a lot of people are able to post games or levels or mods for other people to download and then
Mhm.
try. So it really gave players the ability to kind of become designers. And I think that's been a really exciting thing that's happened for people to experiment with that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And my next question for you is when creating video game worlds, you have to use creativity, versatility, and the ability to capture players' imaginations, much like you do writing stories. So, what would you say the biggest difference is when coming up with stories for games versus books like middle grade or YA?
Mhm. I would say the two biggest things, the biggest differences when it comes to writing and creating for games and books is that um, when you work on video games, most of the time, even if it's a small independent game, you have to be really good at working with other people.
Hmm.
It's very collaborative. It's very something where you have to not have an ego, where you share the creativity with other people and everybody has ideas. So you have to learn to, I mean, I guess for lack of a better phrase, have a thick skin and be able to get used to the idea of, you're not always going to get your way, which when you're writing a book, most of the time you're the voice, you're the creator. And
Hmm.
with the exception of like an editor and an editor team or who works with you on the book, I mean, it's your story that you're telling. And so you have to learn to be okay working with a team of people who are all working on the story from different angles. And the other thing that is key to making games is the interactivity of games, is the fact that the story that you're telling is ultimately going to be the story the player is experiencing, as opposed to the story that you've written that has a beginning and an end. The characters are set, their journeys are set. It's on rails, as they would say in video games. And with a video game, you really want to give the player the tools to have an experience that is unique to them. Even if there's a character they're playing, you want them to come away with something they can say, oh my gosh, I was playing Halo, or I was playing Mario and this happened and this happened and whoa, it was wild. And someone else says, oh, I played that too. And this is what happened to me. And it's different. You can kind of talk about it.
Yeah,
Um, and I think that's a really cool part of it. I mean, I also write interactive fiction, which is a very kind of simpler, more accessible way to create stories with gaming elements, where it feels like you're reading a book, but you also have moments where the player has agency, is what we call it, and has the ability to make decisions that affect the story. And that even something as simple as that changes the whole way you experience the story.
absolutely. That's a great point, what you said about interactivity. Because I mean, people can read books and take away different themes or emotions or think like tidbits about the characters that others might not. But with video games, it's an entirely different story because you have characters you pick, like you said, and you kind of travel on this adventure, but it's not set for you. The
Mhm.
choices that you make greatly affect how the story will play out, which is really interesting and a kind of big difference between video games and books. But in reality, the two are kind of not that different.
Yeah, it's a really fun part about it because
Mm,
you never know what a player's going to do. So sometimes you hear stories about games that you worked on where people do things you never would have guessed, and
Yeah.
it's so exciting to see them using their creativity and trying new things. It's pretty fun.
And I also just want to clarify, I do not play Halo, because I'm not allowed to play shooting games. So
Yeah, I don't play shooting games either, actually.
yeah,
So,
I just stick to the like Minecraft or those sort of games.
which are so creative and cool. Like,
Yeah,
wish that I had
absolutely.
had Minecraft when I was younger, because just watching what people can do in that is great. But I'm with you. I play certain games, but certain games I don't play for my own,
Yeah.
for reasons.
Definitely. And while doing some research, I uncovered some books that you've written for a more YA audience a while back. So why did
Mhm.
you decide to move to middle grade? And if you don't mind me asking, there was a big gap. There is a big gap between the last book you wrote and Spellbinders. So what led to that big gap in years between your most recent book and your other stories?
Um, a lot of that was I was right in the middle of working on some big video game projects where I was sort of in charge of a group of people and big assignments as part of a big video game project. So that was a big chunk of that, was that my video game career was kind of evolving and changing, and I needed kind of all my wits and my creativity to work on those. Um, the other thing too, I think at the same time that was happening with me as a writer was that I had written 3 YA books, which I really love, and I think some readers still think of very fondly. This is around 2005 through 10. But then I wrote a middle grade book. I collaborated on it with a film director named David O. Russell, and it was a lot of fun. It was kind of exactly where I wanted to be, the sweet spot of what I think I do well, which is kind of heartfelt stories that feel real, but at the same time they have a lot of silliness and a lot of goofiness and kind of action, and um, they're both, I would say, like, kind of like mainstream fun stories, but they also have like a core of truth to them. So Alienated, which was a book I didn't know I was going to be working on, made me go, oh, like, I love middle grade. This is really where I want to be. And right when that happened, I then got into this video game project, which took a long time, and I moved to a different town, and a bunch of stuff happened. But Spellbinders is coming along at the perfect time. Like, I feel I'm having a lot of fun. I think that the kind of the way we can interact with audiences and engage with people who are reading the book is so different and so much more fun now and more interesting. And I'm really glad to be doing this book now. I mean, I think the 10 years taught me a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And the middle grade, I guess middle grade has become like, I guess you could call it kind of like the sweet spot at the moment, at least for readers like me, because there's so many different kinds of middle grade books coming out right now.
Right.
It's not just stick to like one genre, like realistic fiction or fantasy, which I love those genres, but I love seeing all the variety in middle grade, how you can throw all these characters who are like similar ages to the readers and put them in situations that might be real, might not be real, but they still feel real as well.
Yeah, I think that middle grade is definitely, is like you hit it right on the head. It's the sweet spot, and it's where the most exciting things are happening. I think in
Mhm.
children's literature is the most interesting, diverse voices are in middle grade. The biggest swings when it comes to trying experimental, structures or voices is all there. I think it's just a really exciting time to be working in that space, and I'm learning a ton from. I'm reading all these authors that I'm like both talking to, but then also just hearing about, and there's just really amazing stuff happening. So I'm excited to be kind of in there somewhere,
Yeah.
right?
Right, and I've loved seeing I've gone to a couple bookstores and libraries in my area, but I was also just in New York City, and I saw Spellbinders there, and it just warms
Oh,
my
that's so
heart
cool.
seeing your stories and the stories of many other creators and authors out there in the world for kids to discover and, like, kind of find their new favorite read. Now let's talk more about your newest book, Spellbinders: The Not So Chosen One, which is a truly a coming of age middle grade book at its finest. From the
Thank
world you create to the characters as well, we all come to know and love your protagonists. And your writing style, it doesn't just engage readers, but immerses them into the story, kind
you.
of like a video game. And you're pretty experienced at that too. So,
Thank
do
you.
you think your work building worlds and crafting video games has helped you with storytelling through the written word as well?
I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that the world building part, which is something I've always struggled with, it has gotten better just
Mhm.
because I've had to do it, a lot of what I do is world building. It's working with a team of people to come up with the basic foundational pieces of a setting or a magic system
Yeah.
or a planet. It really depends
Mhm.
on what kind of what game you're making, but that stuff becomes it becomes the foundation on which everyone else who's working on the game kind of builds. You kind of have to have that before you build out the art, right? Or
Mhm.
the physics of the game. Like a lot of that really depends on the world that you've created. And so that's something I'd like to think I've gotten better at. There's still, I mean, I still have plenty so many weaknesses as a writer, but it's the thing I like to feel like I'm learning about and improving at is uh, a world that has its own logic and that makes sense to people who are reading. It doesn't tell you everything. Like I don't want you to know every single thing about every single aspect of the world,
Yeah.
but I want it when you're reading the story, you don't ask a lot of questions like, well, why doesn't this happen? Or what's the deal with this? If you can read it and enjoy it and feel like you're there and it makes sense, that's what I really want to do. And then I've always been a character writer. So the character part to me is usually the thing I feel most comfortable doing. So I'm thinking that I'm hoping that the world building and the character work are fitting together pretty well.
Through all of the perils of his journey, Ben comes to love and accept himself, which was so heartwarming. And I know that you said you love creating, adding heartwarming themes to crafty and humorous worlds as well. So, do you think that you dedicate this book to all the misfits out there?
Um, I would say yes. I all of my books are about misfits. I don't know how everybody people define misfit differently, and I know that moniker has probably changed over the last few decades since
Mhm.
I was a young person reading middle grade books. Um, but most of my stories involve people who are on the outside looking in and trying to figure out where their place is in the world. And for me, when I was growing up, games, um, board games, role playing games, things like that were definitely like a place where people who didn't feel like they fit in the mainstream, I guess you'd say, sort of flock to these places where they could have some kind of control over their lives, could
Mhm.
write their own stories, could be the heroes of their own stories because maybe they weren't the hero of the story at school, or maybe with their friends they were sort of like the side character and they wanted to be the hero. And back then it was definitely kind of a place for misfits. And I think that as games have become more popular with a lot of different people and you have everyone has them on their phone and what a game is has changed, what that definition is, I think that maybe gamers aren't misfits as much anymore, but there's always going to be
Sure.
people who feel like they're on the outside, right? Who feel like they don't belong and they're trying to find the place where they do belong. And Ben is just, I think, one character in a long line of characters who's doing that. And my books always tend to deal with that because I felt like that as a kid. And I would read books like X-Men and stuff where it's, you know, these little families of people who come together and find a place that they can call home, and were really important to each other. And I think that those things rubbed off on me. So I love the idea of found family, and I love the idea of outsiders finding a safe place.
I love that answer. And while you said I agree, gamers aren't necessarily misfits in certain circumstances anymore. There are so many people who feel like outsiders, kind of like Ben, that everybody assumed and felt like Ben was the chosen one to save this world. But
Mm-hmm.
Ben kind of he didn't think that he was, and really he wasn't necessarily the chosen one, but he just kind of had some kind of kindness in him and authenticity that kind of I mean, of course, he didn't save the world just yet because there are going to be more books coming, and you are working on book 2. And so let's get to that because I
All
am
right.
so excited to read Spellbinders book 2. And you mentioned on Twitter, or I guess it's X now.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you're
Exactly.
supposed to call it these days.
Me neither. I'm in the
It
same boat as you.
feels wrong to call it X now. It just feels weird.
Yeah, it does.
So you mentioned that you finished the copy edits for Spellbinders Book 2, and you also have had sneak peeks of your upcoming cover. And we're gonna talk more about this cover later because it is whew, chef's kiss awesome. And
So glad to hear that.
yeah. So can you talk a bit about what readers can expect from book 2? Will you be adding any new characters, maybe
Mm.
main or side characters? And just a little bit more about the story, but please don't give any spoilers because I want to read this cover to cover and not know I want to know something, but I don't want to know everything.
Okay. Yeah, that's I would love to do that. So I guess a quick sort of tease about book two is that like you do with a lot of kind of book twos in a series, I'm expanding the world a bit.
Mhm.
So in the first book we have the Kingdom of Lux, which is where most of the action takes place. But as you mentioned before, there is a place where there are portals to other realms, and that will come into play quite a bit as a new threat emerges, a larger overarching threat to the whole universe of realms, which is Lux is a part of, and Earth is. There are many other that we have yet to be introduced to. Will come into play, as well as Ben's um, outlook on his own life. When the question he asks himself in the next book is, if I am the one person in a group, if I have to have a book in order to be extraordinary, but everyone else around me is extraordinary on their own, how extraordinary can I really be? And can I keep up with people who are all special and gifted and unique? His best friends, his three best friends, Niara, Merv, and Drake, are all exceptional characters and people from other realms, and he is still an Earthling, but now he's kind of part of the group. And keeping up is something that he finds challenging, and he wants to make sure he's pulling his weight. So that's a big challenge for him now that he's found friends, is trying to keep up with them.
Mhm.
Um, but like I said, there's a new big bad that emerges, and there is a great new character that I absolutely love who kind of enters the picture and becomes part of their group, and it just sets up things to come in a really exciting way. So it's going to be fun, a lot of laughs and a lot of action.
My next question for you is more about your characters. So your characters, Ben, Niara, Drake, they're all so different from each other, but they fit together perfectly like pieces of a puzzle. So I'm curious to know, do you tend to take parts of yourself and put them in the characters you write?
Mm,
Is that why without one another the characters can't really complete their mission? They have to be together. They can't be whole without each other?
that's interesting. There definitely are elements to that are true, and I think um, for me, a big part of this series was trying to take certain things about certain tropes and ideas about games and kind of work them into a story
Mhm,
that was a real person's story, a person who sees the world through the lens of games. Um, and I think the four main characters are less about aspect, they're less parts of me than they are there to represent the parts of like an adventuring party where you tackle things as a group and everybody brings something to the table when you take on an obstacle or a challenge, and that as a team is the only way to overcome an obstacle is as a team, and you can't do it on your own. So I think that's where the structure of that group came about. But then also, just as from a writing point of view, it was a lot of fun to create four different characters who each had their own journey, each had their own voices and perspective on what was happening in the world, and then to put them in little situations where pairs of them would get a chance to talk and kind of like have these fun little interactions with humor, and um, when they would get to know each other and try those different conversations, which as a writer brought me a lot of joy. And I think that they're some of the best parts of the book, is when you get different groups of the characters spending time together and getting to know one another.
absolutely. That's a great answer. And my next question for you is about, like I said earlier, let's talk about the cover art, and not just the cover art, but also the art and the designs inside of
Yeah.
the story. Like the journal entries that
Hmm.
Ben and the journal that he writes into. So, How did you, or maybe your publisher, editor, or agent, track down such a fabulous artist for the job? And did you have any say in the design?
Um, I I did have a so the design of the book was one of the earliest ideas I had, and that's one of the things I pitched it to my agents. The idea of doing a book that had elements of dungeon manuals in it, like the artwork and the little graphical elements. That was something I wanted to do. I pitched it to my agents back in like 2013, 2014, and said, I want to do a book series like this with, it's written as though it's a dungeon manual, but it's like a real world kind of thing. That project didn't get off the ground until Spellbinders came out and during the pandemic, like 2020. And so that right away, that was something we knew we wanted to do. And I don't know how the the designers at Penguin Random House found Lisa Weber. I know that they're ninjas, so they do their job really well, and they can know exactly where to find the right people. But we talked a lot about it. What kind of style we wanted the illustrations inside to be, how realistic, how kind of fun and fantastical. And they would bring samples they would send us samples of different people. And they found Lisa Weber pretty early and said, here are some other covers she's done. Here's her own comic book. She does web comics and she publishes
Oh,
print comics. And yeah, she's done a lot of amazing work. She's incredibly talented. And we saw a lot like the range. She has a huge range of types of styles, and it just looked like a really good fit. And even though and I haven't had a lot of contact, I mean, she's been so incredible about creating kind of what I see in my head and making it real in the illustration. So I feel extremely like blessed that she's been working on the series with me. Um, it's been amazing to see my ideas kind of come to life, but also in like brand new ways that she's interpreted in her own way, which has been exciting.
this is the final question of the interview, the question I've asked every person that I've ever interviewed. If you could be or meet any literary character, you could meet your favorite author, or it could be your favorite
Oh.
character in a work of middle grade or YA or even an adult book. So they could be fictional or they could be real. Who
Yeah.
would it be and why? That's like my attempt at a drum roll.
That's a really hard one because there's so many, right? There's so
Yeah,
many, both
absolutely.
real and fictional and authors and characters. The one that came to mind, and it's funny because I look at this question. This is an interesting question. I look at this question. It could be like Ben would look at it, right, and say,
Mhm.
"Oh, well, I want to be a really powerful character or some like regal person who's got a lot of confidence and power and
Yeah.
has the world at his feet." Or I could be, or I could meet somebody who I think is interesting. And an interesting one popped into my head. One was more, it was more about the world building of this series that I liked a lot. And there's a series called The Last Apprentice by
Oh,
Joseph Delaney.
so cool. I think I've heard of it.
It's sort of horror. It's definitely like kind of a scary supernatural thing, and it feels like historical fiction because it does a great job of building a world that's um several centuries ago in England, but it's also not the real world. It's got a lot of its own like lore and kind of background, but it's very well done. It's very scary and creepy. And the main character is a young apprentice who's the last apprentice of these monster hunters called spooks.
Oh,
And his name is
cool.
Tom Ward. And he is a kid that grows throughout the series. The series is like 12 or 13 books long, and by the end he's like a young man, and he's a kid. And there are parts of the book where he writes his own notes as a kid learning as an apprentice to somebody who's a master. He writes his notes on how to take care of certain monsters and how to do things right. And there's a lot of little elements of that made its way into Spellbinders. And I think that just spending a day in that world, as scary as it is, would be really cool to sort of see a
Yeah.
world that felt real but also felt very supernatural and magical in a way that's believable. So
Hmm.
I don't know why I'd want to be in a book that's scary, but it's a great series, and I learned a lot from his writing. So
Well, that's definitely a series I'll have to add to my want to read um list. And
yeah, you should check it out.
everybody, let us give a wholehearted round of applause for the one and only Andrew Auseon. Your answers were incredible, thought-provoking, and just fantastic. And
Oh, thank you, Train.
if you've already read Spellbinders and Also Chosen One, then you'll already know why I've been so thrilled to have Andrew on my show. And if you've not yet read Andrew's book, what are you doing? Get off this podcast and order your copy for yourself. I'm joking. You don't get off just yet because I got a little bit more to talk about. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an honor and a privilege to have you on because you're a really great guy, and your stories
Mm.
are some of my favorites.
Oh, thank you, Train. The pleasure and the honor are all mine. So
Aw,
thank you very much. And your words mean quite a bit to me. So
thank
it's been
you.
great to be here and to talk with you about this book. I like that you enjoyed it.